Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. 20 University of Utah international students see their visas revoked by the Trump administration. RFK Jr. says Utah has emerged as the leader for banning fluoride and embracing the MAHA agenda. And this Utah man once tried to strangle a woman he's now accused of killing. Lawmakers cut funding for an exam to assess risk in such cases. Later in the program, we'll be talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern and reporter Peyton Harkins. And right now, we bring in Salt Lake Tribune reporter Courtney Tanner. Courtney, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
I want to talk about a couple of stories. We'll start with this one. 20 University of Utah international students see their visas revoked by the Trump administration. I guess it's at least 20, and this at the University of Utah, and there are others at the other institutions of higher learning in Utah. So these are what kinds of students? Obviously international students, but undergraduates, grads. Who's having their visas revoked?
Yeah, so it's students mostly with F1 visas. And so it is undergraduate students and graduates, and then a couple of recent graduates as well.
I think you've heard back from most of the institutions of higher learning. 20 is the most, right? University of Utah. What about the other institutions?
Yeah, and I should say the number is growing every day and honestly every hour. But yeah, 20 at the University of Utah, which is the highest number I've seen across the country, really, for one institution. But yeah, about 50 students total, a little more than 50 across the state. So we've got 5 students at Weber State University, 2 students at Snow College, Salt Lake Community College and Utah Valley University both have 3 students, and Utah Tech University and Southern Utah University each have 9 students.
I understand this is F1 visa. Is this the standard student visa?
Yeah, pretty standard for students that are doing, undergraduate or graduate studies.
So do we, and there are thousands of students, right, in Utah on F1 visas. Do we know why these particular students are having their visas revoked?
I think, sadly, every university in the state and across the country is kind of scratching their heads trying to figure out why. The calculation, like you mentioned, that I did was about 9,000 international students in Utah. So, why these 50? It's been kind of hard to answer so far. The universities haven't really received necessarily, an explanation. They've said like some of these students have violated the terms of their visa. But the violations listed on the federal website are pretty broad. It can really be anything, and most of them don't have criminal records. And the University of Utah, at least, is saying none of them appear connected to the pro-Palestine protests, which we know the Trump administration has kind of been looking at for, revoking visas for international students. So it really is honestly a little bit of a mystery here.
I want to have you expand a little bit on that. The Trump administration has been targeting students who are involved in pro-Palestine demonstrations, I guess, including, I think, officials have been instructed to comb through social media and such to find such students.
Yeah, the Department of State, led by Marco Rubio, has essentially directed staff to look through social media posts for anything that students might have posted that's pro-Palestine or anti-Israel, obviously with the ongoing war there. And one student who led protests on his campus at Columbia University, kind of made national headlines when he was detained. So it does seem to be kind of a pattern connecting students to protests and campus. But at the U, we're not really necessarily seeing that. No one was charged in that. Essentially, there were 21 individuals arrested with the encampment last April, but no charges filed at this point, maybe still pending, but nothing formal. So it's unclear, if the federal government has found something on these students' social media accounts that would point to this. Really just kind of a big question mark. I know one of the students was arrested for allegedly trying to essentially climb a fence onto military property, and a couple have traffic citations. But outside of that, it doesn't seem to be, kind of any unifying reason that they're being targeted in this.
Do we have an idea of a comparison? Say under the Biden administration, What would get you kicked off an F1 visa?
It's a good question. What's different here is that typically you have your visa revoked, and that's not necessarily an unstandard process. I mean, that's happened, throughout presidential administrations and the Biden administration too. But the difference here is that the federal government is now deleting records out of this second system. It's called the Student in Exchange Visitor Information System, or SEVIS. And they're terminating those records, which is kind of a next step. And when those records are terminated, a student essentially has 15 days to leave the country. So that's kind of what's expedited, I guess, in this situation. What's different here, because normally if your visa was revoked, you would be able to finish your studies at least and then leave. But now you have this SEVIS record terminated and you're told, you need to self-deport immediately. Previously, though, when you would have a visa revoked, it would be something related to criminal charges kind of at the extreme end, but at the less extreme end, not really following the requirements of your visa. So not maintaining, full-time student status, or not excelling or meeting the standards to excel in your school program.
So these students have been receiving a letter from the government. What the Tribune, I guess, got a hold of a copy of one of these. What is the letter saying?
Yeah, it says if students don't self-deport in this 15-day time period, that they could face fines, they could face detention or deportation. It also notes that deportation might not be to their home country. It could be somewhere else, it says. So that's kind of a new, I would say, caveat in this situation too. So the federal government is advising students to essentially leave now or be forced out and not be able to reapply for a visa later.
I guess this is unknown. Can they apply for a visa later?
The federal government is saying if they essentially self-deport, if they leave within the 15 days, that they would then kind of turn over their passport and their visa to an embassy or a consulate. It would be destroyed, and then they could reapply at a later date.
Mm-hmm. Now, where are the impacted students from generally?
Yeah, it's a little hard to say on some of the smaller numbers. I think colleges are a little wary at this point, to release information and to possibly identify these students accidentally. The U is saying that about half of their 20 students are from China, and the others are from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, including India.
Mm-hmm. Do we know how many international students are enrolled in the Utah system of higher education?
It's about 9,000 based on
Mm.
my math on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do we know total how many have received these letters or having their visas revoked?
A little bit more than 50 by my latest
Mm-hmm.
count. I will say one school, Utah State University, says it has students affected, but it isn't providing exact numbers because it's worried about privacy. So there are 8 public colleges and universities in the state, and if you kind of add the other 7, you get 50. And so it's likely more than 50 if you know what Utah State's number is.
Do we know a total number nationwide of students who've had their visas revoked?
So far, what I'm seeing is about 300 visas revoked for international students and recent graduates. That's according to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. But based on news reports, it might be more than that. I know that there's some higher education publications that are tracking it, and just based on those, the numbers are soaring by the day.
Mm-hmm. So at least so far, if you I haven't didn't do the math, but 300 nationwide, about 50 in Utah seems like kind of disproportionate in Utah so far. Although you say the situation is expanding day by day.
Expanding significantly, yeah. And I would say, I think I noticed this before, but the U's number is really high for a single school. And that's partially because the U looks for students globally. I mean, it has renowned research and medical programs, and so it really does recruit internationally. And so I think that's a big contributor why the U's number is higher, but yeah, quite a large proportion here in the state.
What are universities trying to do to help? I guess these particular students and international students in general.
A lot of the universities are saying, we have to follow federal law, so they can't necessarily intervene, but they are offering resources as far as like counseling, and they've, given out legal resources that students can reach out to. A lot of the schools too are saying, like, we'll do what we can. If the student has to leave the country, we'll help them finish their degree from abroad. Like we want them to, get their degree. We want them to graduate, and so we'll do what we can to help with that.
You know, in your story, one change that the Trump administration has made is President Trump has instructed immigration officials they can go into sensitive areas. I guess that wasn't the case under the Biden administration. What are those sensitive areas?
Right. Yeah, this is a pretty significant change. And I think, everyone's kind of seen the increased immigration and customs enforcement officers kind of around. But essentially, these sensitive locations were previously off limits and now they're open. And that includes like schools and hospitals. So at this point, like an immigration officer could step on the U's campus. It hasn't really been done in the past. It's usually been seen as a safe place, but now it's essentially allowed by Trump.
One more thing you note in the story, at least one student group is urging University of Utah to become a sanctuary campus, not to not allow immigration officers to step foot there. Uh, any word from the university what they're going to do?
Yeah, the school can't legally block federal officers from entering its ground because it's a public institution. So its hands are kind of tied. And I mean, that's, is what it is. I guess the school is kind of saying, look, we can't do anything else. But the U is noting on its website that its police officers don't have any agreements with ICE and they don't expect to be called on by immigration enforcement. So I guess that's kind of their retort to that.
If you just joined us, you're listening to Behind the Headlines, and I'm talking with Salt Lake Tribune reporter Courtney Tanner. Courtney, I want to move to another story. This is getting a lot of attention as well. As we know, the legislature in this last session instructed universities to make some changes, take some money away from low-performing programs, and potentially apply to put that money into high-performing programs. I guess one of the problems has been, how do you define that? High performing, low performing? Do we have any new metrics now?
We do, yeah. That, like you said, has been one of kind of the biggest criticisms of these budget cuts. The state lawmakers imposed a pretty big chunk of money, $60 million in budget cuts across Utah's public colleges and universities. And like you said, they wanted schools to essentially phase out inefficient and low enrollment majors and kind of reallocate that money back to high demand majors where they could like re-earn the money back as long as they're spending it on those programs. But they were never really defined in the law. And so a lot of folks were worried about that. Like, how do we say what a low enrollment program is? What are the numbers that you're looking at? And during a faculty meeting at the U on Monday, the provost there kind of talked about for the first time what these metrics are, and it was an interesting conversation.
And there's complications, right? What is there a specific number now they're looking at of students enrolled? Below that number, you're low enrollment. Above that, you're okay.
Yeah, it's super complicated, and with any kind of metric, there's always going to be qualms with how you're measuring it. The metric that the U has been told by the Utah system of higher education to look at is to essentially, like, a low enrollment major would be anything that graduates fewer than 40 students a year, which is about 10 majors at the U if you count students who have double majors. So if a student double majored in, I don't know, Japanese and computer engineering, if you count both of those as a major, then it's 10 total. If you don't count double majors, then it's 20 majors that are falling below that mark. Overall, the U has 260 majors, so it's a small proportion of them, but I think folks are still concerned about it. So the provost there, Mitzi Montoya, said, the data throughout all of this is just really challenging. For instance, if you're just looking at these 10 majors that fall below the threshold, you've got really important majors. You've got mining engineering, metallurgical engineering, geological engineering, and one parks and recreation major. And those she sees as, pretty essential to the state and to high demand jobs. So if you're looking at low enrollment versus high demand, which one kind of wins out on that?
So that'd be competing criteria, right? Because the legislature wants universities to focus on high-paying majors that lead to high-paying jobs and to jobs that are in high demand in Utah, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's why the U is a little stressed, maybe is the best way to put it about this, because it is competing. It's which one do you want us to prioritize?
I think the provost also pointed out, what about a major that's not quite meeting that criteria, but you have a lot of people taking it as a minor, right? Or what about certificates?
Right. I think that's kind of her concern is that, if you're just looking at majors, you're not counting the popularity of certificates or minors that are in those same departments. I mean, you might have a lot of students that are minoring in a language but aren't majoring in it. And that doesn't really also include the flexibility for enrollment change. So, like a major might be, gaining enrollment, but it just started out. And so it's not quite there yet, but it's going to get there. It's expected to get there. Just a lot of, fuzziness with the numbers.
Another thing Provost Montoya pointed out is on the high demand, high paying side, the legislature is mandating that, for example, liberal arts majors in the humanities, tend to get up to some a nice pay scale later in their career, but the first 5 years maybe be lower paying.
Yeah, this is a really interesting part of all of this. And I will say it's something we kind of did a deep dive on back in December, I think. So if you want to go read more about it, check out that liberal arts story. But yeah, essentially, the state has said look at high paying jobs, but it's put a cap on that within the first year after a student graduates. And Mitzi Montoya says, that 1 year mark is really not enough. A lot of students are just getting established. And national analysis does show that shorter time frame does disadvantage students in the liberal arts, which has been, an ongoing concern from professors in that area that have worried that their degrees are kind of on the chopping block. But yeah, by 5 years in, those students catch up in pay. And so it depends on, again, like these numbers are fuzzy depending on which cap you put. If you look at 1 year, liberal arts aren't doing great. If you look at 5 years, they're fine. And so I think there's just a lot of confusion over the numbers and frustration and not really knowing where to go.
Montoya also points out that missing from these numbers, at least in this configuration, is students go to medical school, other graduate programs, also students who, I guess, immediately start their own small business.
Yeah, and that's a huge kind of incomplete part of the numbers. And there are a lot of data sets that schools can look at. And I think that's what the commissioner over higher education, Jeff Landward, says, you don't have to base this on one number. But yeah, if you're looking at, this one data set that the System of Higher Education and the Department of Workforce Services, put together that looks at job numbers, it doesn't count a lot of things. If a student's a small business owner, if they're like a music major who teaches private lessons, they're not counted, but they might have a really high wage. And, there is some kind of holes, I guess, in the dashboards that it's just causing concern.
Some faculty, you might say a lot of faculty, at least some faculty, are not happy with this mandate from the legislature. One comment, I guess, was, so our goal is to teach people how to become wealthy. That's the one professor's comment.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. There's been pushback from the beginning with these budget cuts, but I think there's a lot of pushback when the numbers are focusing on how much students make after they graduate. I think that that's just a concern that's not what higher education has ever been pointed toward is salaries. And I think there's concern too with the focus on jobs, right? I mean, you have technical colleges that are pretty focused on, you come in, you get the skills, you leave, you get a job. And that's just never really been what universities are shaped like. I mean, universities have a general education program that all students take that's just supposed to teach students how to be citizens and how to think and how to write. And, that doesn't necessarily translate straight to a job, but those are skills that jobs use, and that's great. But I think this salary and job focus is causing a lot of angst.
Well, thanks for telling us about this. Salt Lake Tribune reporter Courtney Tanner has been with us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Following a brief break, we're going to be talking with State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern. And here's the headline. RFK Jr. says Utah's emerged as the leader for banning fluoride and embracing the MAHA agenda. Hope you'll stay with us. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. And in this segment, we're going to be talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern. Emily, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
You bet. So interesting story. Here's the headline. RFK Jr. says Utah has emerged as the leader for banning fluoride and embracing the MAHA agenda. So you covered RFK Jr.'s visit to Utah. He's on a swing, I think, right? After Utah went to Arizona. Um, I guess remind people what MAHA is, first of all.
Maha is essentially similar to MAGA, which people are probably a little bit more familiar with, right? The Make America Great Again slogan from President Donald Trump's campaign. Maha just replaces the great with healthy. It's something that Kennedy kind of took on after he knew that he was going to be coming onto Trump's cabinet. As a lot of people might remember, he was an independent presidential candidate in the 2024 election cycle. He ended up dropping his campaign. And pretty soon after, he announced that the Trump campaign had essentially promised him a spot if Trump was elected of overseeing health in the country. And so he's kind of made, as he's taken this position on, his agenda has kind of centered around this, what Maha slogan and what he thinks that means.
Now, Make America Healthy Again, his vision is somewhat controversial, right? For example, you note in the story, I'm skipping to kind of to the end of your story, Kennedy came to Utah after attending the funeral of a second child who died of measles in Texas. He's been a vaccine skeptic, I think, Kennedy.
Right. He's kind of a long history of spreading information that is, often false or misleading around different parts of healthcare, including especially around vaccines. He came under a lot of criticism for his basically, raising doubts about the efficacy of the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and that leading essentially to measles outbreaks. There, were some in various island countries, in Samoa, and that has raised a lot of concerns about what his messages might be as he takes on this position. He raised doubts about the COVID vaccine as well. And as you mentioned, there's currently a measles outbreaks in the country, and he's shifted his message a little bit on the MMR vaccine and said that it is the most effective way to prevent the spread of measles. But people still worry about where his views on scientifically proven medical treatments, on whether, various diseases actually have risks, could reemerge in the future and put public health at risk in the United States.
So I guess part of his tour, he went to University of Utah. He also met with some legislators, right? And that's where, I guess, somewhere in there, he praised Utah, the legislature, for banning fluoride from the public water system.
Right. One of his statements as he held a news conference with lawmakers at the University of Utah was that Utah's emerged as the leader in, quote, making America healthy again. And that's because of a few different bills that it passed during this last legislative session. And one of those, starting in May, will make Utah the first state in the country to ban fluoride from its water. Another prohibits families who use food stamps from using those to buy soda. And then another one limits school cafeterias, schools from providing food that includes synthetic dyes and other chemical additives. The one that I would say the ones that have been most controversial are the ones limiting the use of SNAP, the essentially what people know as food stamps, from buying soda, and also the fluoride ban. Fluoride has been scientifically proven to help strengthen tooth enamel, reduce tooth decay. But what he says is that having fluoride in water and ingesting it, he claims that it leads to other health woes. Some of the claims he made was that it lowers children's IQ, and that it is associated with bone cancer, thyroid disease, other neurodevelopmental disorders. There is conflicting evidence as to the accuracy of those claims. There's no established definitive answer as to whether it actually does that. But we have seen that in communities that do use fluoride in their water, there is a significant decrease in dental decay.
So Secretary Kennedy spent part of the day touring a holistic health center at University of Utah, right? Met with Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson and legislators. Speaker Schultz, Mike Schultz, Speaker of the House in Utah, he said he'd like to see the federal government ceding more responsibility back to the states.
Right. So Monday was kind of interesting in Utah because you had Secretary Kennedy, but you also had the head of the EPA, Administrator Lee Zeldin, and you had the Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, all here in the state on the same day. And Speaker Schultz said during a news conference that one of the things he'd been asking these members of Trump's cabinet was for Utah to take on more of the oversight that the federal government has historically done in the past. And part of the goal there is to remove regulations in some spaces. Some of those are environmental regulations. And the speaker told me when I chatted with him after that one of the spaces he's most interested in removing those regulations is in the nuclear space. And right now, Utah's looking at using more small nuclear reactors for energy. And it's actually joined a lawsuit trying to remove federal regulations when it comes to using such reactors.
I'm guessing the Trump administration would be looking somewhat favorably on such moves, right? Transfer of some responsibilities from the federal government to the states.
Yeah, potentially. And I think it depends kind of what spaces they're asking for that in. But the speaker did say during the news conference that he was happy with how the administration officials responded to his request, and that they said they would look at things that they could hand over to the states. But, he essentially said that he was volunteering Utah as a laboratory for this kind of thing. I think he said, we'd like to stand as a national experiment, allowing us to keep some of the federal dollars that would go toward these programs and then run it as a state.
Now you mentioned, along with fluoride, another controversial provision that the legislature passed prohibiting families from using food stamps to buy soda. So I guess have been comments from people on food stamps, or what's the pushback that's been there?
A lot of the pushback has been around, whether people who have lower incomes are being treated equally to, the rest of this state, and what message taking that choice away sends to families who are struggling to make ends meet.
Mm-hmm. Now, Representative Kennedy, Senator Lee have introduced bills inspired by these new state laws. What, I guess, under that rubric of health?
Yeah, and so far, the ones that they have taken on have been Representative Mike Kennedy, who's the newest member of Congress from Utah. He's looking at similar regulations around what can be served at schools to children, and what ingredients those foods can include. And that's one that's actually seen, quite a bit of support across the political spectrum. I guess one challenge that has been raised was the state and then potentially the federal government, the state mostly, would have to make sure that schools have enough money to make those changes. And then the other one is that Senator Mike Lee is looking at some changes to the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, which is, again, food stamps is the more familiar way people refer to it.
So when RFK Jr. went to University of Utah, there apparently were protesters. In fact, there's a photograph here of some. So how many protesters, and what were they saying, or what did their signs say?
There were a few dozen, and a lot of them were taking aim at some of the other critiques that have been made against RFK Jr., both when he was running for president and also when he was seeking confirmation to be the Secretary of Health. And one was someone took a jab at his Make America Healthy Again saying, and had a poster that said, Make America Scientific Again. People had posters that said, research saves lives. Another one had one that said, Make academia great again. So a lot of it was, taking aim at some of the inaccurate information that he has amplified and spread around, science broadly and more specifically healthcare.
Anything else you'd like to say about the story?
I think, it's an interesting space to continue watching where we have in Utah a legislature that has a supermajority of Republicans, how the legislature will continue to try to align its priorities and its lawmaking in the next few years with the Trump administration. And so I guess we'll see how that happens, and we'll see whether the Trump administration is willing to hand over some of its programs to Utah. And, does Utah have the resources to manage those? And what are the potential consequences to Utahns of not having federal oversight in some spaces?
Well, in this part of Behind the Headlines, we've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern. Emily, thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.
And you are listening to Behind the Headlines, weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Coming up in our final segment, we'll be talking with Salt Lake Tribune reporter Peyton Harkins. Here's the headline. This Utah man once tried to strangle a woman he's now accused of killing. Lawmakers cut funding for an exam to assess risk in such cases. I hope you join us following this break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams, and we turn next to Salt Lake Tribune reporter Peyton Harkins. Peyton, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we want to talk about this headline. This Utah man once tried to strangle a woman he's now accused of killing. Lawmakers cut funding for an exam to assess risk in such cases. A very impactful story. And action by the legislature, I guess, or non-action. So tell me brief the story you begin the story with. Ricardo Trujillo Rogel basically tried to strangle his wife, I guess, or his partner.
And so I mean, just to be honest, I didn't really know about this guy until late March, because as I'm sure most of the listeners will remember, we had an Amber Alert late March, and he, was the subject of it when he, allegedly took his children after this, second allegation that we know of, that he had choked his partner. And so, basically I got into this story by looking into that case. I went through and kind of looked into his past criminal history, and I saw that it was June 2021, he had been accused of, it just seems kind of like randomly, strangling his partner at the time, who was pregnant with one of the children that, ended up being taken as part of that Amber Alert later, last month. And so, it took some kind of connecting the dots there. It's like we had this Amber Alert that happened, looked into the case history, saw that, in 2021, he'd been accused of domestic violence and strangulation. And then, in this incident that, precipitated the Amber Alert, it was the same woman that he's accused of abusing. And this time, he's accused of strangling her and actually, killing her one way or another. I think he's accused of stabbing her, and then he allegedly set their mobile home on fire after he left. So anyway, it's like drawing the through line between those things, which ended up being that, at some point in between these two incidents, lawmakers, in an effort to, kind of better address domestic violence, had, put a bunch of money toward these strangulation exams. We can sort of talk about why that is, but that was the impetus of it. And yeah, they ended up cutting that funding, sort of right before the second incident happened, such that the next time something like this happens, somebody in a similar situation may not have access to those exams.
So the victim's name is Myra Catalan Dimas. A tragedy here. 19 at the time of the original thing, I guess 23 or so at the time of her death. Yeah. So why this focus on strangulation?
Yeah. So basically, what domestic violence victim advocates have, tell us, and what research has shown is that, when somebody perpetrates domestic violence against somebody, there's, basically a list that you can go through if they check off a number of these things, you can tell that they might be at higher risk for, escalating their violence such that they kill somebody later on, And so it's like the questions they ask are like, do you have any children with this person? Has he ever threatened to kill you? And I'm saying he, but I mean, it can be either gender. But one of the questions they ask is, has this person ever tried to strangle you? And strangulation is a big factor because it's just, it's kind of almost one of those deals that if you check the box there, you don't even need to look at other boxes. There's enough risk for escalation there that, you can kind of move on. And so they wanted to put, money towards strangulation exams because, one, they're so common. Apparently this happens in close to 50% of DV cases where somebody is killed or something like that. It happens in a high percentage of DV cases. And then it just has such a high degree of risk associated with it. And then 3, it's like, depending on the time that you report the incident or the time that police arrive to investigate it, there may not be outward signs of, that you were strangled. Like you might think that a bruise or a red mark would appear soon after, but sometimes it doesn't, or sometimes, it doesn't appear at all. And so basically the idea was that, there was funding so that police could send these victims to get, a forensic test basically to prove that they'd been strangled, kind of similar to how you might do like a rape kit after a sexual assault. And then you have kind of concrete evidence that this thing happened, and it's supposed to help with, prosecution later on.
So when Myra Catalan Dimas, the original Ricardo Trujillo Rogel, originally strangled her, this was not in effect, right? Then it came to effect, but now, in a month or so, it will these monies will not be available again, right?
Yeah. So this, I struggled for ways to write this, because it's like, the case was sort of, basically in the between times of both these incidents was when she could have had access to this, this exam, and she did not. But yeah, I think they passed the funding for it in 2022, and this this incident, the first one, took place in 2021. So as far as I can tell, she didn't get a strangulation exam back then, and it's not clear what difference it would have made, but it might have made one. Who knows?
Yeah, and this is that is pretty stark, right? 50% of the cases, pretty strong indicator of potential escalation of violence. Now, how does this relate to something the legislature also did, or I think, 22 or 23, lethality assessment?
Yeah, so they passed a law basically making it so that every time police investigate, or are called to a domestic violence case, they have to, run through this lethality exam or this lethality screening, I think is what they call it, through run that through with the victim. And so, those are those questions I was talking about earlier that, can determine, basically how likely it is that the violence will escalate. And so basically this question about strangulation, must be asked as part of these lethality assessment screenings. But there's not going to be, in June or whenever this funding runs out, there's not going to be sort of a second prong to that, which is where they can ask, if the victim feels comfortable, going and getting this forensic exam done. So it's like they'll still have that checkbox, but unless the department decides they want to fund it themselves, and not, because right now basically they're reimbursed by the state if they do it. they won't be able to have this test piece, basically.
So you talked to the head of the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. She says we might have to just go out and get private money. We got to have this money for the strangulation exam, and if the legislature's not going to do it, then we're going to have to find some money.
Yeah, no, and it's even then, she was telling me that, like, yeah, we're going to be looking for outside monies. We're kind of flabbergasted that we even have to do that. But also, this isn't the type of thing that we should be having to, ask for money every year. Like, basically she would like to, bring this back at some later legislative session and try to get it funded in a different way, like maybe through DPS, like rape kits are, or something like that, just so that, just to kind of streamline the process. So it's not the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition that's having to, ask for the money and then appropriate or, reimburse people, through them. They want it to be through a state agency.
So this case and everything we've been talking about illustrates very painful realities of domestic violence, right? You talked with Sim Gill, I think. Tell me what he's saying. He's acknowledging that there are a lot of complications with regard to prosecuting perpetrators of domestic violence.
Yeah, no, definitely. Part of the reason they're so complicated is because you also have to kind of weigh the victim's interest in the case too, and it's like he talks about, for so many different reasons, a victim may not, want to participate in the criminal case, against the person accused of abusing them, and it might be, he gave the example of, like, this person has children with their abuser, and the abuser has a job that provides health insurance to those children. And so it's like they have this calculation of, like, okay, if this person goes to jail, like, how, they're obviously not going to be able to work. My kids aren't going to have health insurance. Is it worth, they just have to make this, like, weird balancing act. And so he was, and then on top of that, if the victim doesn't, want to participate in the process, what evidence might there be? If there might be physical evidence that police collected at the time, like maybe broken glass, or something like that. But basically, these forensic strangulation exams were kind of just another piece of, like, concrete evidence that could be used in those cases. Like, say if the victim doesn't want to, speak on the stand, or something like that, but they will be interested in this test, that could help them out there. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's just they're hard cases to try. And he was kind of saying that, yes, let's put money toward strangulation exams and lethality assessment tests or screenings, and all that stuff. But he was just saying there's so much that we should probably be doing before cases get to this point, like providing resources for these people before the abuse gets so bad that the police gets involved, and stuff like that. Like, there needs to be sort of a holistic solution to this, that even, if they had funded strangulation exams this session, there's still pieces to address that come well before this, sort of in the process of domestic violence. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. One thing the legislature did do, I think, is increase penalties for strangulation.
Yeah, they did that. What was it? I think 2017 or something like that. I mean, that was a while ago. And from what I understand, Utah was one of the, sort of the lagging behind in that, so, they upped strangulation, I think, as part of, like, aggravated abuse or something like that. Like, strangulation is now a aggravating factor there, so they can bump up the severity of offense, from my understanding. And so, I mean, we're all kind of building, the ledge seems to be building on the work that's done over the years. And yeah, advocates this year were, disappointed to see that strangulation, exams weren't funded. And they said that it kind of undermines some of that past work.
You end your story telling us a bit about Myra Catalan-Dimas, the victim here. I think that would be appropriate to end this part of the program. Tell us a little bit about what her mother said about her.
Yeah, her mother wrote a very touching obituary, I thought. It talked about, she apparently had a pretty, quick wit. The part that sticks out to me was, I'll just find it and read it for you. It says she had an insatiable zest for life, a love of anime that makes us seem like casual viewers, and a passion for swinging so high in the park that we often feared she would simply fly away. And I think that gives a pretty good, insight into who this person was. And I just thought the imagery of her swinging so high in the park, I thought that was beautiful, and I wanted to include that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image. Yeah, very appropriate. We just have a couple of minutes. I want to have you tell me about another story you published. Here's the headline: Utah agreed to pay a Nevada company up to $1.7 million to screen prison mail. The concerns quickly piled up. So you begin the story saying Utah's prisons had a mail contraband problem, and so they went to a company that specializes in prison mail. It seems like what could go wrong there? I guess some things did go wrong. So Pigeonly is this company. What do they do?
Basically, they do a bunch of things, but what they do as it relates to Utah prisons is they're kind of this middleman as it relates to letters. And so, it used to be that if you had a loved one in one of Utah's prisons, you could write them, kind of directly at the prison, and they have their mailroom there, and they screen it for contraband, and all that stuff. But apparently, contraband was getting in, and like when I talk about contraband, I'm talking about things like drugs and stuff like that. And there's also apparently there's something called nuisance contraband, which is like staples or just other stuff you might include in a letter that's not bad, but they don't want it. So anyway, now instead of just sending it directly to the prison, the inmate's loved one would send it first to this processing, like Pigeonly's processing facility in Las Vegas, and from there a staffer would scan the letter, the photo, the greeting card, whatever it is, kind of digitize it. Then a staffer, kind of look for cursory issues, like if there's drugs or something, obviously get rid of those. But then a Utah corrections staffer would then screen it for their various, policies, like there's certain provisions on like sexually explicit things, and stuff like that. So they're looking for kind of their more internal process, internal policy violations or whatever. From there, the issues that make it past that process, Pigeonly would then print out the letter, their scanned copy of the letter again, put it in an envelope, send it then to the prison where it would then be delivered to the inmate. And it's kind of, it's a bit of redundant system, but there's safety and redundancy. Engineers know that, and I think that was kind of what this plan was based off of. But yeah, issues started piling up. Letters weren't getting to inmates as fast as people would like them to, if they got to them at all. Sometimes they're delivered to the wrong people. Just kind of a host of issues.
The company got in financial trouble, I think, right?
Yeah, they got in financial trouble before Utah.
Before they
agreed.
did the contract.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like that. I think that they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protections in January 2024. And I think in Utah's deal started with them this January.
So what, just about 30 seconds left. What's Utah going to do at this point?
So I'm not too sure. They tell me that they're, evaluating, their relationship, in that they're talking to Pigeonly, they're trying to resolve the issues. But looking at their contract, there is an out for the state to take if they decide to take it, and I'm not sure that they will or have any desire to do that. But I saw that in the contract, and I know that they're also doing some kind of small tablet-based pilot program so that people that want to get in touch with their loved one who's in prison, they can do some kind of sort of email or IM type system, as opposed to sending letters. And that way too, drugs aren't going to get in, because you cannot digitize those things.
Right.
So I know that they're kind of looking into that too.
Yeah, the safety concerns, understandable. Family members,
Mm-hmm.
Code Your Story will encourage people to go read the story, are saying,
Sure.
hey, our loved ones need communication of some kind, right? So they're
Yeah.
concerned with the delays, but
It gets lonely, and they
yeah.
feel like they're being kind of forgotten about. And so it's like, say your daughter gets married and you don't get pictures of that happening until 3 weeks later. I mean, that makes you feel bad, and you're in kind of a lonely place. And so they just want that, they want that fixed. So.
Well, Peyton Harkins, Salt Lake Tribune reporter, has been with us telling us about this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again.
We've also talked in this hour with reporter Courtney Tanner and State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern. And you've been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Hope you'll join me again next time.